In this video, you'll learn how to do a scoping review, and we will focus on the review process. So hopefully by the end of this video, you will know the basic steps of conducting a scoping review, and you will also be familiar with the main review process steps to conduct and complete a literature review. First, let's take a step back. All reviews, whether you're doing a scoping review, systematic review, meta-analysis, narrative review, they follow a universal structure consisting of 5 steps. Now, Cresmer recommends a 5-step process for doing any type of review. The first being identifying terms to typically use in your literature research. The second step being locating the literature. The third step, reading and checking the relevance of the literature. The fourth step, organizing the literature you have selected. And finally, the fifth step, writing the literature review. So just to briefly summarize the main steps from Creswell, the main steps in a literature review kind of looks like this model right here. First, you have a research question that will guide your review, or several research questions for that matter. Next, you will develop some inclusion-exclusion criteria, which will determine what to include in your review and what to exclude as well. Next, you start doing your database searches, where you gather the literature, and then you implement the inclusion-exclusion criteria to sort through your findings. When you have determined the number of studies that you want to include in your final review, you start synthesizing these findings, extracting data, and then you write up the review. Now, do note that this is not a straightforward process, but it's actually an iterative process where you would revisit some of these steps as you go along and as you discover what you know and what you need to know more about in terms of writing up the review. And this can be pretty frustrating because it takes a lot of time, especially adjusting the search string, adjusting the inclusion-exclusion criteria, and then also that has consequences for the research question and how this is phrased. So today's video deals with the scoping review and the scoping review process. Now, Zachary Munn and colleagues at the Joanna Briggs Institute Research Methodology Group have provided an updated definition of what a scoping review is. And they argue that scoping review is or are a type of evidence synthesis that aim to systematically identify and map the breadth of evidence available on a particular topic, field, concept, or issue, often irrespective of source, that is, primary research, reviews, non-empirical evidence, within or across particular contexts. Scoping reviews can clarify key concepts/definitions in the literature and identify key characteristics or factors related to a concept, including those related to methodological research. Let's look at scoping reviews in more practical terms. Now, scoping review is a type of literature review methodology with the process of summarizing a range of evidence in order to convey the breadth and depth of a field. The purpose of scoping review is to examine the extent, range, and nature of research activities, determine the value of undertaking a full systematic review, summarize and disseminate research findings, or identify gaps in the existing literature. So you might consider doing a scoping review if you are planning on doing a systematic review, just to determine whether it is worth doing a full systematic review or not. That is the evidence that you want to capture with the full systematic review, is it out there, and is it worth investing time to do a full systematic review? There is no quality assessment or appraisal in a scoping review, but in a full systematic review, that would be criteria for getting a review published. You would have to have some sort of quality assessment or appraisal tools. And this is also a very flexible type of review, and it is ideal for disciplines with emerging evidence and open to include different types of study designs and types of literature, both published and gray. So in this type of research design, you can include both qualitative and quantitative studies. These can be both published and gray literature. It all depends on the type of criteria that you set. So it's compared to a full systematic review, it is definitely one of the most flexible designs out there in terms of doing a review. In terms of reliability and validity, you have to be pretty transparent when writing up this type of review and leave a paper trail throughout the process. So in this case, it is very similar to the systematic work that you do with a systematic review, where you have search strings, you have search logs, you also have inclusion-exclusion criteria, you have overviews of synthesis, and you usually have more than one person on your review team to make sure that you are in agreement with the coding and the inclusion-exclusion of these studies. Now, the time frame for doing a scoping review is between 6 to 12 months, and this is trying to be realistic. It takes a long time to do this, especially if you are a new PhD student or a fresh or a researcher who is not familiar with the review methodology. So here I would estimate maybe up to 18 months to 24 months from start to finish, and finish meaning that you have your review published in a journal. What you can potentially do is to write a review protocol as a pre-study for a scoping review, and there are several benefits for doing this. One of them being that you can get in touch with the reviewers at an earlier stage, who can give you input on what you need to worry or what you need to consider when actually doing the full study. Another benefit is that you can actually get a publication out of this too, if you decide to publish your review protocol, and there are several journals that actually accept review protocols for full publication. Now, one of the reasons why scoping reviews have become so popular is because there are several frameworks out there that structure the whole process from beginning to end. One of the most famous frameworks is perhaps the one by Arksey and O'Malley from 2005, who have a 5-step process for doing a scoping review, starting with identifying the research questions, identifying relevant studies, doing a study selection, charting the data, and then finally collating, summarizing, and reporting the results. Now, some might say that this framework is starting to get a little bit old, but you can see that it's still being very widely used in the research literature. So it has really withstood the test of time, and it helps structure the work process from doing a review, which might be a little bit overwhelming, especially for researchers not familiar with the review genre or with new PhD students. One study that I will refer to quite a bit is the scoping review by Han Han and myself on Flipped Classroom in teacher education. This study follows the 5-step process of Arksey and O'Malley, and the paper is structured in such a way that you can follow the steps in the framework, and that each step corresponds to different sections in the text. And this is quite normal in scoping reviews. And these types of reviews can be good model texts for your own review when you are structuring up your own paper. And it helps craft sort of like a workflow for which steps you need to work on next and which steps have been completed. The first step in any scoping review, irrespectively of what kind of framework you're using, is always about identifying the research questions. Now, with scoping reviews, these questions usually start with a very broad frame or broad scope, and then after you do some initial searches and get a feeler for what's out there in the field, you start to narrow down your research question. But usually you start with a pretty broad research question. Now, Now, with scoping reviews, it does accommodate different types of study design. So you can mix qualitative, quantitative, mixed methods, types of research studies. Now, it can be very helpful to envision the intended output of your study so that you can decide what is the purpose of your study. Are you going to create some sort of framework? Do you want to map the knowledge gaps in the research field? Do you want to create new theory? Do you want to showcase some type of phenomenon in the research field? So these types of things are good to have a clear thought about before you start to craft up your scoping review and start crafting your research questions. What is the purpose of your study? Now, some research tips. It could be helpful already in the introduction to introduce some sort of agenda or issue that you're trying to solve. Like, what is the big problem here? What is the so what with your study? Try to also work on doing a mini review before you actually do the review. So this is a little bit confusing for many people in the terms that in order for you to do your review, that is, you have to do your literature review. You have to actually do a literature review for your literature review. So you have to do sort of like a mini review in the introduction or background section to showcase and justify why is your review important. And also in this sort of section, try to introduce your research questions as early as possible, as well as the agenda for your review. And if this sounds a little bit confusing, it can be very helpful to look at all the papers that do this so that you have some sort of model text to base your review on. When you are identifying your research questions, it could be a very useful exercise to map out your key concepts. And here I want you to use your research question as a guide. Now, your research question or questions should contain at least 2 or 3 key concepts that are relevant for your review. And you can use different techniques or tools such as mind maps or Venn diagrams to map out synonyms that are related to each of your concept. So for instance, flipped classroom has several overlapping synonyms such as inverted classroom, flipped class, flipped approach, flipped structure, flipped instruction, flipped model, etc., etc. And the same goes with the other key concept that was in the Han and scoping review, where we have teacher education as a different concept. And when we map out the concept of teacher education, you can see several other types of synonyms such as aspiring teacher, future teacher, teacher educator, student teacher, etc., etc. And if you are uncertain what kind of synonyms can be related to your key concept, you can consult with a thesaurus in the databases, where key concepts are indexed in sort of like its own tab, or you can consult dictionaries, or you can consult other types of papers that are within your field and see what kind of keywords they have listed, because keywords give sort of an indicator of what kind of concepts have been used in the papers. Say that you're finished identifying your research questions and now you are curious to see what kind of studies you would find that would be able to answer those research questions. So that's when you move on to the second step of identifying relevant studies. Now, in this step, I highly recommend that you consider assembling a team so that you're not doing this all by yourself. And that also has consequences for the validity of your study. So if you're doing a review all by yourself, then who do you consult with when it comes to developing a search string, developing your inclusion and exclusion criteria, and then assessing the relevance of the studies? At this stage, you want to consider also starting to develop a search string based on the concepts that you identified for your research question, and also create sort of a grid with criterions for inclusion and exclusion. Now, most scoping reviews have these kinds of grids and also list their search strategies using Boolean operators and/or. and not. So you can find good examples in already published studies. Now, again, I would just emphasize using mind mapping tools to get an overview of your core concepts, and also ask for help if you are missing synonyms that relate to these concepts. It can also be very helpful to look at previous publications that are very similar to the ones that you want to do, to see what kind of key terms are used or keywords are listed for their abstracts. Also, engage the librarians for your help. They can really help you out with putting together a robust search string, trying it out, and finding relevant databases that you should be searching for your study. It's also very important that even though your research question is quite broad, you have to sort of narrow the scope using criteria. Otherwise, you will be swimming in sources and you will not be able to manage your time right. So having very clear criteria for inclusion-exclusion is essential to get our scoping review done on time. And here you also have to assess what kind of available resources do you have, how much time do you want to invest in writing up this kind of review. And this also has consequences for what type of evidence that you want to include and exclude for your review, such as whether or not you should be including gray literature or not. In one way, you can look at the first and second step as a funnel. You want to ask broad questions to see what kind of study is feasible to conduct. So you would start out with something very broad, which is illustrated at the top of the funnel. And as you work your way with defining and getting an understanding of your key concepts and including these in your research question, you are slowly narrowing down the scope of your study until you find the true focus of your study. So this is like moving from the top of a funnel until the very end. And this is a very common process in all types of research, starting broad and narrowing it down as you understand what has been done previously and what your contribution to the field can be. Now, in any type of review, having clear criteria that are explicitly stated in the text is important. And you can see criteria as sort of decision rules, what to include and what to exclude. And this helps with the transparency and validity of your study, so that other readers can see how you justify excluding and including a study, or excluding a type of evidence. Here's an overview of common inclusion-exclusion criteria that are found in most scoping reviews and other types of reviews. Now, one of the most common ways to exclude a study and to set up sort of a framework for your own study is to set a start and end date for your database searches, and start end date for when a study has to be published. So those studies that fall within that time interval are included in the review. Other types of criteria are, for instance, exposure interest, geographic region or location of study. So for instance, if you're only looking at studies published in Europe, then all other regions fall outside of the review. Language, usually we include publications written in English, but if you have some sort of if you have a team where you have other types of languages that can contribute to reading the publication, then that is a huge asset. So having somebody who can read French, German, Chinese, Spanish can contribute to including a number of sources that usually are not included in a review. And this can also help avoid publication bias, which is usually geared towards English-speaking countries. Other criteria include participants, whether or not a publication has been peer-reviewed or not, whether the publications have any report outcomes, the setting, study design, and the type of publication. Are you looking at, for instance, peer-reviewed articles published in online journals, or are you also maybe looking at including great literature, which might be a bit more difficult to find, and where in some cases this type of literature is not published in open databases? If you are wondering what kind of databases are relevant for your search and for your field, you should definitely consult with your supervisor, colleagues, or with the university librarian. They have an excellent overview of the metadatabases and the databases that are relevant for your particular field and for your topic. Now, the different source could be the list of academic databases and search engines that are posted on Wikipedia, which is usually a pretty updated website for looking at different databases that are available. If you access oria.no, you can find a list of databases too, indexed by letter. Here's a sample of databases that are relevant for those studying educational sciences, psychology, social sciences, poli-sci, etc., etc. So for the review, I highly encourage you to be flexible in terms of how you collect your data, and that you don't exclusively go for the scientific databases. There are a number of other outlets where academics now publish research. So finding these outlets and channels can be quite helpful to shed light on whatever you are investigating. So this is the interface for the ProQuest host database, where I'm looking at the academic database ERIC, which is quite relevant for those of you doing educational sciences. Now, I would always go to the advanced search because that gives me much more flexibility in terms of how to craft a search string. And also here I can tick a number of boxes which apply filters to my search. But when you start doing a search, you should not tick any of the filters just yet. And that's to try to keep your search as open as possible. Now you also have a thesaurus tab where you can construct a search string based on terms that are already indexed in the database. And also you can get lots of help for how to construct a search string through visiting the search tips, or to just go on YouTube and look at tutorials for the different databases. And this is because the different databases have different search syntax. So using, for instance, ERIC versus Web of Science can be a different experience. And this is also where the librarian can help you construct a search string and to use the different databases. Most of you are probably familiar with Google Scholar, which can be a very helpful and powerful tool in any type of review. There are some limitations to how systematic you can be in Google Scholar, but I do not recommend excluding Google Scholar for that reason. Maybe what you could do is that once you start searching systematically in the scientific databases, you can use Google Scholar to supplement those searches, and say you want to limit your search to the first 50 to 100 hits. That way you can also show to the reader that you have considered Google Scholar as a source, but it's not the only source for a literature review. That would not be sufficient. Social media platforms where academics sort of linger around, like ResearchGate, Twitter, Academica, and LinkedIn, can be very useful sources to locate literature that might not be indexed in the database searches, or which hasn't been published yet. So in a lot of these channels, research would publish pre-publications, or they would upload drafts to publications before they get published. And encountering these can be quite tricky if you do a database search. So here you can use these academic social media channels to supplement your database searches, just to sort of try to cover a broad net when doing your searches. But bear in mind that this can be quite time consuming, as most of these databases don't have, or services for that matter, don't have a very systematic way for you to search and locate these sources. One type of source that researchers usually have to deal with when they do a review is so-called gray literature, and this type of literature can be quite hard to find because it's not necessarily published in any type of journal, and because it's not been published in a peer-reviewed journal, it hasn't been through the sort of peer review process that articles have been through. Now, materials that are defined as gray literature are master's, bachelor's, and PhD dissertations. So if you have written a PhD dissertation consisting of articles, that means that your articles are published, but your synopsis is not published. If you have written a PhD dissertation that is a monography, that means your dissertation is gray literature. Conference publications are also gray literature, unpublished manuscripts, recommendation and technical standards, patents, presentations, and also very important reports from government. So white papers, strategy documents, school curriculum documents are all considered gray literature. And it's very important that when deciding on the inclusion-exclusion criteria, that you make a decision very early on in your review whether you're going to include gray literature, because this literature is quite difficult to get because most of it is not indexed in the databases, which makes it sort of gray. It goes under the radar. So if you want to include gray literature, then you have to figure out a systematic way to find this type of literature, and you have to sort of argue why you want to include it. For most researchers deciding to include or exclude gray literature, it boils down to a question of quality. Can you trust the quality of the source that you are including? And how do I distinguish between gray literature and published literature? In most databases, there is an option that you can tick, a box that you can tick, that you want to only include peer-reviewed literature in your searches. So this could be one way for you to make sure that you do not include sources that are not peer-reviewed. So here's an example from the ERIC database where you have a peer review button here, which limits the results only to peer-reviewed literature. Now, if you also notice in the source type listed below, you can see that there are also books, reports, and one conference paper proceeding included in the search. So you would have to make sure that the source that you are including is indeed peer-reviewed. So you can't fully trust the database here. Sometimes it's been indexed under gray literature and peer review at the same time. So here we have to make some use our common sense essentially to figure out what type of source this is. One thing is whether an article is peer-reviewed or not. Another thing is whether the journal that these articles are published in have what the quality criteria are for these journals, whether this is an accepted journal or not. This is something you can find if you visit the NSD's website on the channel registry. Here you can see, you can type in the name of a journal if you are unsure of whether it has any academic merits or not, and you can see whether it's been indexed under level 1 or level 2, being the ones that are accepted for so-called publication points in the Norwegian system. If they happen to be on level 0 or they're not indexed at all, or there's a level X, then this would raise a red flag whether you should include a publication or not. Now's a good time to stop and think a little bit about the aspects that have been discussed in this video so far. So I want to raise the question about gray literature. So think about the following. What is the role of gray literature in your project? and how do you plan on using great literature in your review or not. So please try to think about these key points, write them down, and if you have the chance, discuss your ideas with your supervisor and or colleague or research colleague who you are doing your review with, and see whether these are aspects that are important to consider when you draft up your inclusion-exclusion criteria. Say that you have completed your database searches in one or multiple databases and that you now have a number of results that you want to start going through. And this is where you come to the study selection phase, where you actually select which studies to include into the final review. So here it's important that you report the search results from different databases and sources in some sort of system, and what we recommend is that you create a table or a model that shows the different databases that you've searched and the number of hits that you've gotten in these databases. Now, from the database hits to finding out what is relevant for your review, this is where you start applying your inclusion-exclusion criteria. And this is done when you start screening the results for titles and abstracts. And when you do a screening, you're just basically doing skim reading. You're reading it very, very briefly, and then you decide whether this is relevant or not, and whether you should include this in the next step of the screening and study selection, which would involve reading the full study, doing a full text reading. Now, when crafting up something that communicates this step to the reader, it can be very helpful to use something called a flowchart, or this one here is based on the PRISMA framework, the preferred reporting items for systematic reviews and meta-analysis statement. There's a separate PRISMA framework or extension for scoping reviews that is now available, that is now often used with scoping reviews. And this is a way for you to communicate your results or the search process more clearly and more transparent with the reader. Also mind that this is an iterative process, like I said before. So it could be that you are not happy with the database searches, or maybe you are excluding way too many studies, or maybe you're including way too many studies. So this is maybe a sign that you might have to go back and adjust your inclusion-exclusion criteria, or maybe even adjust the research question. So maybe you're going out too broad, or maybe you're going out too narrowly. Here's an example of a different flowchart from a different scoping review by Karin Birgitte Dille and myself. You can see how the flowchart also includes the full search string and has some graphics here to sort of illustrate the inclusion-exclusion process. So based on this, you can see how a flowchart can become quite complex if you decide to include these kinds of steps. But this also helps communicate the process more clearly with the reader and increases transparency, and also increases the likelihood that your study will be published. When you are satisfied with the number of studies that you have found for your review, you proceed to the fourth step involving charting the data. Now this involves synthesizing, extracting, and interpreting both qualitative and quantitative data in the studies. And what you want to do is that you sort the data according to key issues and themes, especially if you're doing a qualitative analysis. Very commonly, people do qualitative content analysis where they look for patterns across the data set, across different publications, and then they do some counting or extracting different kinds of numerical data. So for instance, you would look for the year of publication across the different studies. You would look at the country region across the studies, looking at what kind of methodological paradigm has been used, what are the research instruments, which methods for data collection were used, what are the characteristics of the participants, which sample were there, and what outcomes were there from the different studies. And here you have to be uniform across all the studies. So you have to do this with every single study that you've decided to include. So this is very basic sort of demographic overview of the different studies. And then when you want to start digging deeper into the different sort of findings across the studies, then you do something called either a thematic analysis, or you do something called the coding categorization, which is also very similar to constant comparative method. Now here, it could be very useful to use a spreadsheet to sort of type in the data that you get from different studies, and try to, especially when you go and review the studies, that you go beyond short summaries or profiles, and then you try to see, okay, so how do these studies answer my research question? What is it about these studies that is relevant for answering my research question? It could also be very useful if you have some sort of analytical framework that you've used to apply this when you analyze the different studies. So for instance, if you're using cultural historic activity theory, that could be an analytical framework they use as a theoretical lens when looking at the different studies. What I recommend is that you look at different reviews, and then you see how have they gone about analyzing the data, and you sort of borrow from their reviews. And also, this can be quite an overwhelming task to do manually in a spreadsheet, so I would also consider using different types of computer software to help you support the data analysis. The software is not going to do the analysis for you, but it can only support you when constructing your themes or coming up with different categories that you want to present in the more qualitative part of your review. Just to follow up on the part where you're not supposed to only write short summaries of the different findings, and this is where you're supposed to sort of synthesize the findings, meaning that you're supposed to combine them into something new. And what Pollitt and Beck say is true when they say that reviewers should strive for a review that is insightful and that is more than the sum of its parts. So basically, when you put all these elements together, you're adding to the field of knowledge when you're creating something new through a knowledge synthesis, combining one or two or more elements into something where the result is something new. That is where your study and your review is actually making the original contribution based on the previous research that you are accumulating and synthesizing in your review. A key element in every review is the synthesis part, which means to combine two or more elements to form a new whole. So in literature review, the elements are the findings of literature that you gather and read, and the new whole is the conclusion that you draw from these findings and how you answer the research questions that you have posed in your review. So with synthesizing, you are drawing conclusions about findings so that you can identify how the literature addresses your research question. So this process involves gathering literature that addresses your research question, reviewing the literature and taking notes, describing, making short summaries, analyzing, and then identifying key concepts across the different studies. So when you are synthesizing, you're basically comparing and contrasting two or more studies with each other, and then you are critically evaluating and interpreting what these studies are saying that adds to your research question. Maybe you can also in the process look for the gaps, the blank spots. What are they not saying about your research phenomenon? Because these blank spots are also important findings that you can recommend other researchers to look into. So what are they not saying? What is not being addressed across all of these studies? That is also a very important finding to bring up to the reader. When you are charting the data from the different studies, it's very common to use a table or a matrix that looks kind of like this one. Now these tables can be extremely long and big depending on the number of studies that you've included in your review. So sometimes it might not be feasible to include it in the main text, and you would have to add it as an appendix at the very end of the reference list or after the reference list. And this also has some consequences to the number of words that are included in your review. So for some journals, if you have an appendix, it's not counted into the final word count, which means that you can spend more time or more text and more space on describing the results of your study. These matrices are usually very similar across different reviews, and it's very common to borrow these matrices from each other. But then if you do borrow a matrix from a specific review and you don't do any alterations, or you do some tweaks to it, then it's sort of common courtesy to refer to the original author's work. Here's an example of a matrix that Rune Krumsvik and I did for a review paper that we did in 2014 on ICT integration in secondary school teacher education. Now, the matrix ended up being so large, being 42 studies, that we had to put it as an appendix to the main article because, yeah, like I said, it was too large and it just spiked the whole word count. So by having it as an appendix, we were able to free up space in the main manuscript to write more about the findings for the review. And it's very common to use these kinds of elements when you are extracting data. So this table right here is something that I was inspired by looking at other types of reviews on similar topics. We now come to the final step in the system scoping review process, where you start to collect, summarize, and report the study findings across all the included studies that you have for your review. Now, this step involves presenting sort of a narrative account of the existing literature. So you have your matrix, right? But the matrix doesn't really do any narrative per se. So it's up to you to sort of present an account of what you have found across the included studies. Now, for the first sort of element, or the first part of the presentation of your results, you usually do a basic numerical analysis of the sort of extent, nature, and distribution of the included studies. So you could give different kinds of bar charts of the publication trends over a certain time span. You could also showcase the distribution between experimental, non-experimental studies, qualitative studies versus quantitative studies. And you can also here in this stage adopt a position or approach when writing about key issues and themes across studies. So what is your approach to this? How do you want to be critical? For instance, do you have any specific theories they're using as a lens when you're approaching these studies? If so, then you should declare it in the results section. So here, especially in the first stage of reporting your findings, it can be useful to use tables, charts, and models to communicate sort of the basic numerical findings. And try to see if you can also here identify gaps or dominant areas or contradictions, and then sort of like trying to find new frontiers in your field. And in this stage, and this is probably the most difficult part, is try to read between the lines, like trying to discover meaning that is hidden or implied across these studies. Looking for missing elements are also results. So especially when you try to do your analysis, your thematic analysis, the more qualitative part of your analysis, you're trying to read between the lines. So if you have, say that you have 5 different studies, they're saying different things about the same phenomenon. How do you approach that? So we'd have to find some sort of way to communicate the findings and see how these findings can shed light about the research question that you have asked. In a lot of cases, having a matrix that sort of tries to capture everything about the studies that you included is not really feasible. So another approach is to try to present snippets or snapshots from your corpus. So in this case, Karin Birgitte Dille and myself, we did a scoping review on online professional development amongst teachers. And here we're trying to present some of the studies that we have included by focusing on the first author's name, the year of publication, and the title of the study. A different chart from the same study focuses on the journal that the study has been published in, the different focuses, aims, and intentions with the studies, theoretical perspectives, methodology, which online activity that the teachers had to undergo in their professional development, the duration of the program, and some information about the participants. So this is also a way to sort of make these really big and complex charts more complex, so to reduce complexity and make it easier for the reader to read or understand what you're trying to say. And when you have these smaller charts, it's easier to integrate them in the main manuscript as well, instead of putting everything as appendixes. Here's a different framework from a scoping review by Lee, Lund, and Wood Steya. This is about a scoping review on active learning in higher education, different frameworks for active learning in higher education. So you can see that in 4 columns, they have managed to communicate quite a bit of information just in 4 columns here. In Arksey and O'Malley's 5-step framework, there is also a 6th optional step called the consultation exercise. This basically involves input from stakeholders, practitioners, and consumers that could have an interest or be impacted by the results of your review. Now, consultations can yield additional references, or it can shed new light or perspectives on the findings reporting in the literature. So this is usually you involve consultations once you've written up the final draft of your review. So you're ready to send it in to a journal, but you want to make sure that stakeholders also have a say and can shed light on the results of your review. And maybe that can result in edits that you have to reconsider some of the results that you have, or maybe you can include this step in the review and make sure that you have quality assured the results with stakeholders and practitioners and consumers. You have to consider whether the cost or effect of practitioner involvement is worth the effort, because it's already a very time-consuming effort to write this type of review. So you have to check what type of resources you have available, such as time. And then if you decide to go for a consultation exercise, you should reflect on who are the experts and key players in this field. Who are the key authors? Are there any unions or membership associations you can contact for input? Are there any in the private sector, in the industry, that would have interest in this, that can shed light on what you're doing? So this is another step that could be very helpful, especially in cases of very sort of hot, debatable topics and sensitive topics. Now we're moving into the literature review process, where we focus more on retrieving the studies that we're going to be synthesizing and analyzing. So in your 3rd and 4th step of your scoping review, you are probably concerned with how am I actually going to get these studies, how I'm going to actually use the databases. So now we're going to have a look at how you can use, for instance, Boolean operators to construct a search string, and how you can use those terms in a database search. One way we can locate references without doing database searches is through snowballing. Now with snowballing, you are basically looking at studies that cite important studies that you are including, or that you think you're going to be including in your literature review. One way of locating studies that cite studies is going through Google Scholar and looking up different studies that you, for instance, include in your introduction and background section for your scoping review or any other type of literature review. Then you go to the option where you can see who has cited the study, and then you can chase down references. And then that way you can find studies manually by screening whether they are relevant or not for your review. Now this is usually a step that you do as a supplement to a database search, so it's not recommended to do this at the very beginning of a database search, but it could also be a way for you to get a feeler of how many studies actually refer to these kinds of studies, and maybe you can find some important keywords also by doing the snowball searches that can help you build up a search string. So it could be a part of the sort of iterative process of database searching. Snowballing also involves going through reference lists of studies that you see are important or relevant for your search. It could also be that you do reference list searches or snowballing searches on the studies that you have included in your database search in order to expand the number of studies that you want to include in your search. This could be a strategy that you use to supplement database searches, and especially if you are not happy with the number of hits that you gotten in a database searches, so you want to expand the number of studies that you want to include. Now do remember this is also quite time consuming because it has to be done systematically on every single paper that you have included in your final search in order to create sort of like a uniform search strategy. So this is, as I said, a supplement and shouldn't be the primary search strategy that you do. This can actually be very helpful if you're trying to chase grey literature, because grey literature, as I mentioned before, is very difficult to locate in the database searches. So chasing up references in reference lists can be a way for you to locate these unpublished studies. Another supplementary search to database searches are so-called manual searches. This one basically means that you select a number of journals, and then you go through every single published issue and volume of that journal within a certain time span. So say that your scoping review is from 2000 to 2010, and that means that you're selecting a particular number of journals, and then you go through every published volume and issue from 2000 to 2010 to cover for studies that might have not been picked up in the database searches. So this is also a supplementary search and should not be your primary search because it is also quite time consuming. Now if you do include manual searches and also snowballing searches, that means that you need to be explicit about how you have implemented these into your text. So you need to write this explicitly to the reader so that they know that you've done this and for what reasons. Like why do you choose these top 6 journals within your topic, for instance, and not other types of journals. Let's talk about Boolean operators. These 3 operators, and, or, and not, are probably the most important tools that you can use in your database searches, and it's important to know exactly what they do. And operator is used to connect 2 keywords to decrease the number of search results. So say that you're doing a study about video games and you searched a particular database and you got 18,000 results. And that is a quite large number if you are a team of 2 or 3 reviewers. So in order for you to narrow it down, you could say that, okay, I'm going to look at video games amongst teenagers. So then you would include the AND operator in your database searches. And then all of a sudden we narrow down the search results to 547 results. The OR operator is used to expand a concept with synonyms. So, and this is used to increase the number of results. So say that you have, you want to do your search on video games and teenagers, but you know that another way of talking about teenagers is through the term adolescents. So you did your a preliminary database search on teenagers and you got over 105,000 hits, but you know that you can also get more hits if you include the key term adolescent. So you include an OR operator in the middle, and then all of a sudden you have nearly doubled, or you have more than doubled the number of results. The NOT operator you can use that to exclude key terms that you know are not relevant for your database search. So say that you want to do your study about video games, but you're not interested in video games that have outcome measures that discuss violence in video games. So then you can use the NOT operator to exclude those studies. Now do note that this operator can also exclude studies that might be relevant for your search. So it's highly recommended not to use this term unless you are very certain that you're picking up a lot of studies that are interfering or disrupting your search. So say that you're searching about professional development in teaching, but you're also picking up a lot of studies that are discussing professional development in nursing and nursing education. So in that case, it might be relevant for you to include the NOT operator and include nursing as a keyword there to try to exclude all those studies that are being picked up in your database search. Here's an example from the flipped classroom and teacher education scoping review. We are looking at two big concepts, flipped classroom and teacher education. You notice that we have quotation marks around the terms. It's because the terms are consisting of two or more words, and they're so-called compound terms. That's why we have to tell the databases to search these terms and not the single words. So that's why we put these quotation marks around the terms. For the first operator, you can see that we're using the AND operator to combine flipped classroom and pre-service teacher. We also know that flipped classroom has been referred to as flipped learning, so that's where we're using the OR operator to sort of expand the term. We also tried out excluding primary schools or studies discussing primary schools and flipped classroom, but in the end we ended up not using the NOT operator because a lot of the studies that were discussing teacher education were also discussing primary school as a site for trying out flipped classroom. So this is also one of the things why we recommend not using the NOT operator as much unless you're absolutely certain that there's a specific context that you want to exclude from your database searches. On the last slide, I was discussing phrase searching. That is when you surround the compound term with quotation marks. And here you're basically telling the database that your word must appear as an exact phrase instead of the singular words. So this is a technique you can use to narrow your search. Other two searching techniques are truncation and wildcards. Now with truncation, you're basically removing the ending and adding an asterisk to the end of a word. And that will tell the database to retrieve results that include every word that begins with a letter you have entered. So you use this to broaden your term. So for instance, the word teach has multiple endings like teacher, teachers, teaching. So in order to capture all those different variations of this term, that's why you add the asterisks. With wildcards, you're just replacing one letter with a word with a wildcard to account for variability in the spelling. So a woman, women. One final search technique that is important to keep in mind is nesting, and that is when you use parentheses to keep concepts that are like together and to tell database to look for search terms in the parentheses first. And this is a technique that is based on algebra, and here I recommend that you consult with your librarian when using parentheses or nesting to do your searches, because there are some variability between the different databases, and this variability is something that your librarian might be more aware of than YouTube videos, for instance. Although there's a lot of help looking at tutorials on how to construct a search term and how to use the different database searches in, for instance, a YouTube tutorial, especially by the different publishers and libraries. So you use basically nesting to broaden your search list. Now's a good time to start and think a little bit about what has been said so far, especially about the use of Boolean operators to help construct your search string. So in this reflection task, I want you to think about the following. How will you use Boolean operators in your search string, and what concepts will you investigate? So this is a good time to revisit the 3 different Boolean operators, and also revisit your concepts and use some sort of mind mapping exercise to flesh out the different synonyms related to your core concepts. So I want you to write down your search strategy using proper operators and database syntax using nesting, truncation, and wildcards and compound terms where that is applicable. Then I want you to discuss your strategy with, for instance, your supervisor or a colleague or somebody working in your research team. And this can help you get some input on how you can refine, narrow, or broaden your search string. And then I guess the next natural step would be to try to use this search string in database search to test it out and see how many hits do you get, and then look at the results. Are you happy with those results? Are they too many results? Are they too few results? And how does that impact the way that you phrase your search string? In this final part of the video, we will be looking at the review and synthesis process. That is, how do you extract data from your collected papers, and how do you use that data to write up results, report the results from your review. Now, in this part, there are more examples on resources that you can look up to help you in the writing process, and not so much tips on how to do the actual writing, because the writing is more about academic writing. So for the writing portion of the paper, that is reporting the results, I highly recommend finding some reviews that are really relevant for your study, and look at how these authors express the results in the text, and use those texts as model texts for how you can structure your own paper. So good papers use these as good writing models. Pick up the terms and phrasing that they're using, pick up on the structure, and see, think about what is it about these papers that make them so good? Like, how do they communicate the results in such a proper way? And look at also papers that are highly cited. Why do you think these papers are cited so much? It could be about the novelty of the results, but it could also be about the communication of the findings. Here's an overview of software that might be relevant for you in your review process. Now, the top 5, I would say, that are used in scoping reviews and systematic reviews are most likely Covidence. This is a very good tool. It's fully cloud-based, where you can, together with a team, screen results from a database searches. So it's basically a screening tool, but it's getting expanded as we speak. So there are more options available than just screening coming in the next year or so. Another software is EpiReviewer. Now, this is a software that has to be downloaded, but it is a complete systematic review software where you can upload your results and you can code and categorize them together with a team. Another tool that is very commonly used in qualitative data is NVivo. This can also be used as a complete suite for your literature review, importing your results as PDF texts or pictures, and then from there on out you can code and categorize them. Rayon is also a cloud-based software that can be used from start to finish throughout the process, starting with importing your database results and then using that software to help you code and categorize and report on the findings from a study. Litmaps is another type of software that can help you visualize the results, and that can help you with seeing connections that might not be so easy to see between different types of reviews. Reference software also play an important role in any literature review, because when you are working with the results, usually you export the results to some sort of software for then to use it in another type of software, or you want to work with the results within any type of reference manager. You can also export the results from different types of reference managers to these other types of qualitative data softwares like NVivo. And I know that NVivo has complete tutorials on how to do a literature review if you just look it up on YouTube. Now personally, I use Excel quite a bit, any type of spreadsheet software when I do the charting of the data in any type of review. I've also used NVivo, but more and more often I tend to go back to Excel because it's easy to use and it can give me outputs such as charts and tables in a way that it's not so resource demanding as maybe NVivo is. NVivo does other things much better than Excel, but I often use that for other types of data and projects. And one of the reasons why we want to use software is this principle of replicability. Software usually leaves some sort of paper trail, and it should be that any type of review should be able to be replicated by another type of reviewer by applying the same decision rules and criteria, and through doing this process they should be able to come up with the same conclusions as you did. So another reviewer, say that you've sent in your paper to a journal, should be able to use your search string and your inclusion-exclusion criteria to be able to come up with sort of like similar results as you did. And this is also why it can be useful to have screenshots from the software that you're using to sort of show, for instance, the coding and categorization processes, which are usually quite difficult to capture in any type of paper. So this helps with increasing the transparency in your study by leaving a paper trail. When you do database searches in any type of database, say that you use ERIC or Web of Science or Scopus or ScienceDirect, it can be very helpful for you to first create a profile on that database. And then every time that you do a search, you make sure that you are logged in first to your profile. What happens is that every time you do a database search, your searches will be saved in the history file under your profile, so that at any point in time you can go back and revisit your searches by just clicking on that search under your profile. So you don't have to type in the search string all over again every time you do searches. Also in your profile, you can actually combine searches in your profile. And more about this is something that your librarian or you can read up on the different database searches. But this is basically another way of structuring your searches and trying to narrow down your number of hits. Having these searches logged here can also be a way for you to establish some sort of paper trail for yourself later on, in case your review is disrupted for any type of reason, because this is a lot for you to remember when you're doing all sorts of projects and perhaps also some sort of teaching. In your publications, you can also create a paper trail or create some sort of evidence showing that you have done the database searches by creating diagrams or flowcharts or tables and matrices where you plot in the number of hits that you have from different databases, or in the case of the Røkenes and Krumsvik review from 2014, we plotted in the number of hits that we got on the different keyword combinations in the databases. If you look at different frameworks like the Prisma statement, they can be also helpful for you to structure database searches in different steps. When you're doing a review, you also have quite a bit of working documents in the background that never really see the light of day once you have published the review. Some of these documents could be a search protocol where you also do a screening of which results to include and which not to include, and where you also just sort of keep a log for yourself of when did you do your database searches, what keywords were used, who were the authors, are these studies relevant or not, etc., etc. So this is an example of a search protocol that was sent to me by a colleague of mine in Denmark, and who wrote on his publication that the search protocol for the study is available if you contact the author personally. So I did. I contacted the author and he sent me this search protocol. So this is a service that you can offer in your own publication to increase the transparency of the study. Also, some journals offer you to upload supplementary materials such as search protocols and coding matrices, which also help increase the transparency of the study. Here's an example of two books for qualitative and quantitative analysis that you can have a look at if you're interested in finding resources that can support your data analysis for the literature review. Here are two other examples of books that can help you support the coding process, especially the qualitative coding process when you move over from the more mapping stage to going more in depth on comparing the different studies and looking for themes or codes and categories that go across different studies that you have collected. As with any other type of data analysis process, what you're doing in the synthesis stage is that you're looking for patterns and how these patterns seem to repeat themselves across the different studies. You're also looking for discrepancies in these patterns to see if there are any disruptions, if there are anything that doesn't really fit, if there are any questions that come up, or there might be any gaps that you see haven't been filled. So noticing these patterns or disruption to these patterns are findings that you can present in your review. And you are basically trying to organize this into some sort of system and presenting this in a narrative account through your results section. For a lot of people, the data analysis kind of looks like this. You go through your paper highlighting with different colors, and then you color code using different post-its throughout your manuscript. Now, this can be as efficient as using software, because when you're using software, especially software that you're not familiar with, you would have to invest quite a bit of resource in terms of time to learn the different functions of software. And this also goes for how you want to create a system when you're color coding with paper as well. What I do like about software is that it's often searchable within the software, what you're looking for, and it's easier to find things compared to when you're doing the color coding on paper. But the first type of screening can also be very useful to do on paper, because the writing that you do is perhaps a bit more immediate than when you're doing it based on texts or sort of screen reading. But this is also just up to personal preference. So this is a screenshot of how I would work through different abstracts when I code my studies. So this is a basic overview coding that I'm doing. This is like a first step coding of included studies where I notice different elements like what is the study context, what kind of study design was used, who are the participants in the study, what kind of instruments for data collection were used, and also what are the results of the study and how are these results relevant for answering the review question that I'm asking. So I would go through different types of PDFs and use the comment function to write little notes, and then I would later extract these notes into an Excel spreadsheet and plot it into a matrix. Now the good thing about using it, using a matrix and using an online sort of software or digital software when writing notes like this is that I can search for this across papers. So then I can start building up a corpus and see certain patterns repeating themselves based on the keywords that I searched for. So for instance, I can search for mixed methods design, and I would see that, okay, 10 out of 42 studies used a mixed methods design, and I can use that as like a result to present in my review. So this is a review in action. This is a photo taken during the 2014 review that I did with Rune Krumsvik on ICT in teacher education. So here we did several screenings. So this snapshot here is taken from the final screening where we did a full text reading of several hundred studies, and then we basically divided into two piles, yes and no, those being excluded and those being included based on inclusion and exclusion criteria. And basically gone to work here using highlighters and lots of notes in the margin. And had I done this review again, I would have probably used some sort of software like Covidence, Royan, and NVivo to ease up the process of locating a lot of these keywords again. But I had my own system, and this is sort of like what everybody needs to do. They need to create their own system that works for themselves. Now I'll show you some ways you can structure your findings in different types of tables. So in the review that I just mentioned, we found 8 approaches or 8 themes based on a reading of 42 studies that were included in the review. And we decided to structure this in a matrix that looks like this and included that in the text, just to sort of show what strategies or approaches were repeating themselves across the different studies. So these approaches that we found, the 8 ones, are basically patterns that we identified across different studies. And then we try to showcase this in this matrix here. Using word clouds, which is a function that you can find in NVivo and also as a standalone online service, can be a way for you to visualize patterns that come across in a text or across texts. So in this case, we typed in the text from a study on big data and information science, and you can see that the themes that sort of stand out, or the keywords that stand out, are big data, information management, storage, millions, science search. So this gives you some sort of indication of the most important words or the most frequent words in the text. And this can be a way for you to try to visualize like the main findings or the most important words in this text. And it can give you some pointers of what could be a potential theme in a text like this. This is a figure borrowed from the Johnny Cialdania book, The Coding Manual, showing you how the coding process works. So basically you're going through your different studies, those will be the data, and then you attach codes to those studies. Those codes eventually grow into categories, and the categories grow into themes. And then you sort of base your themes on or you develop your themes into concepts and eventually a theory. So this is how you can go and code your work if that is a feasible approach for your review. So here's an example from the 2014 review by myself and Krumsvik on ICT in teacher education. So here, one of the categories that we developed, or approaches that developed, was modeling. So the codes that we attached to the different papers were, for instance, zone of proximal development, instructor as role model with technology demonstration, speaking out loud while using the tools. And eventually what we did is that we merged all these codes, which are kind of tags that we attach to the different papers. We merged them into something that was more abstract, and it became the category modeling. And this is how you work your way from data to code to category to theme/concept and to more of an overarching theory and theory development. Here's an example of a thematic analysis that we did for a review on, at the time, learning analytics, which was an emergent area in 2014-2015 when we started writing up this review. So what we did is that we collected a number of sources from database searches, and then we basically ran a thematic analysis on all of these papers. And we charted the results as the themes in a chart like this, and then we wrote up some other types of interesting information in the far right column called Other. One of the model texts that I would like to highlight for writing up your own review and also for structuring your results section would be the Connolly and colleagues paper on systematic review on empirical evidence on computer games and serious games. Now, the way that they've structured up their results section, you can see here highlighted in yellow, where they highlight the number of papers that correspond to different themes or categories that they developed, and then they go more in depth on the different papers or the more high quality papers that they've said show the different findings and compare and contrast the findings. So this could be a way for you to also structure the results section of your own paper. So finding these highly cited papers that communicate their findings pretty well can be a good, give you some good tools and writing tips for your own review. Now, this summary table is from the same review on computer games and serious games, where the authors have about 129 papers in total that they have to say something about, and where to try to showcase the different nuances of the paper through different tables and charts. So here is an example of how they classify the papers into different subject disciplines, and then they do a counting of what the different games correspond to, which categories they correspond to. And this can be one way to showcase the different variances or nuances in the papers that you have collected. Here's also an example from the same review paper where I'm showing you the matrix, an overview of the different papers that they've included as an appendix to their paper. Now you can see here that in only 4 columns they're able to communicate quite a bit of information about the different papers that they have included. So the more columns, it does not necessarily mean that you get to describe more. You can actually condense quite a bit of information into these columns here. But it also sort of forces you to be very economical with the type of words and what kind of words you want to include in these types of matrices. Here's an example from a scoping review by Karin Birgitte Bille and myself, where Karin Birgitte has developed a model, a visual model based on the themes and findings from her review. So if you have somebody on your team or maybe yourself familiar with different types of visualization tools, or you're just very, very good at drawing, and creating these models can be a very helpful way to visualize the findings to the reader. And it helps communicate your findings more explicitly than just having everything in text. Here's another model that Tony Berner created for his review on portfolio assessment. So you can see that the model, of course, reflects the different themes that Tony has presented in his review. And it's a very easy figure that you can set up in SmartArt or something in PowerPoint or in Word. So it doesn't need to be extremely complex with lots of colors, but the model is very, very clear and helps communicate the findings in a very explicit way. If your findings, on the other hand, are extremely complex, such as the one in John Hattie's synthesis of over 800 meta-analysis relating to achievement, you could consider using very intricate graphics, such as this dashboard, which shows different effects on achievement. Here's an overview of resources that can be relevant for you, whether you know what kind of review you would like to do, or if you're still unsure and haven't really decided on what type of review that you want to do for your project. Anyway, I would highly recommend that you read The Systematic Approaches to a Successful Lit Review by Andrew Booth and colleagues, as this book or resource treats any type of review as a systematic endeavor. So whether you do a narrative review, scoping review, mixed methods review, meta-synthesis, or systematic review, Booth and colleagues want you to approach any type of review as a systematic, in a systematic way, using very systematic techniques throughout the whole process. And you can read more about this in their book. Here's another overview of recommended readings. Some of them have been mentioned before, but here you get the full references of some of the resources that I would personally recommend that you read up on if you are serious about doing any type of literature review. Early on in the review process, it can also be relevant for you to already start thinking about what kind of journal you want to publish in, or where you want to send in your manuscript. Different journals have different guidelines in terms of word limits and scope and aims. So this would also influence the choice of review that you want to submit, and also influence which journal you would pick and how you structure your journal. So for instance, if you were to submit your review to Educational Research Review, that journal has a specific word limit and also has a specific setup and how they want you to structure your review. So having these guidelines in mind or already from when you start doing your searches can be helpful for the future writing and review process. Here are the references used in this video. Hopefully some of these can be helpful for your review and for writing up your project. Thank you for watching this video, and thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, feel free to drop an email or send me a message on any of the social media platforms. I have a presence on some of these platforms, but hopefully I'll hear from you, and good luck with your review.